If you grew up poor in Britain, you didn't need a bank statement to know it. Your weekly shop said it all. Here are the grocery items that meant you were skint, even before you knew what skint meant. Number 1. Powdered milk. Let's start with the classic, powdered milk. If you ever had a cup of tea that tasted faintly of cardboard, you know what I'm talking about. Marvel, St. Ivel, or the own brand stuff. This was the go-to when fresh milk was too dear or the milkman's bill was overdue. It lasted forever, didn't need a fridge, and could be stretched for weeks. But let's be honest, it never fooled anyone. If you grew up with powdered milk in your cereal, you knew your family was counting every penny. Number 2. Government cheese. If you were really struggling in the 70s or 80s, you might remember the infamous government cheese. Issued as part of welfare support, this processed block was rubbery, bright orange, and could survive a nuclear winter. It was free, it was filling, and it was a badge of hard times. You'd find it in sandwiches, on toast, or melted into pasta, if you could get it to melt at all. If government cheese was in your fridge, you knew things were tight. Number 3. Spam and canned luncheon meat. Spam, princes, or just luncheon meat. If you grew up poor, you probably had a tin or two in the cupboard at all times. It was cheap, salty, and could be fried up for breakfast, slapped in a sandwich, or diced into a stew. Real ham was for Christmas, spam was for every other day. The sound of the tin opener and the smell of frying spam is a memory that sticks with you, for better or worse. Number 4. Tinned corned beef. Corned beef hash, anyone? Tinned corned beef, Frey Bentos, Prince's, or the own brand stuff, was a staple for families on a budget. It was filling, packed with protein, and could be stretched with potatoes or onions to feed a crowd. Sliced thin for sandwiches, or fried up with whatever veg you had left. It was a far cry from a Sunday roast, but it kept you going. If you had corned beef for tea, you knew payday was still a long way off. Number 5. Value white bread. Forget artisan loaves or bakery fresh sourdough. If you grew up poor, it was all about the cheapest sliced white bread, sun-blessed Mother's Pride, or the supermarket's own brand. It was soft, bland, and went stale in a day, but it filled you up. Toast for breakfast, sandwiches for lunch, bread and dripping if you were really skint. The plastic bag would crinkle in your hands, and you'd know this was the bread of the working class. Number 6. Porridge oats. Branded cereals were a luxury. If you were poor, breakfast meant porridge, Scots, Quaker, or the big unbranded bags from the grocer. Hot, filling, and dirt cheap, porridge was the breakfast of choice for families who needed to make a little go a long way. You could stretch a bag for weeks, and if you were lucky, there'd be a sprinkle of sugar or a splash of golden syrup on top. If you had porridge every morning, you knew your family was watching the pennies. Number 7. Tinned vegetables. Fresh veg was for special occasions. If you grew up poor, it was all about tinned peas, carrots, or potatoes, usually the supermarket's own brand, always on the bottom shelf. They lasted forever, tasted of the can, and were a staple in stews, pies, or just on the side of whatever else you could scrape together. The brine would slosh out as you opened the tin, and you'd know this was what making do looked like. Number 8. Margarine. Butter was a treat. Margarine, Stork, Blue Band, or the own brand tub was what you spread on your bread, melted on your toast, or used in baking. It was cheap, lasted ages, and could be used for just about anything. The taste was never quite right, but it was what you had. If you grew up with margarine instead of butter, you knew your family was stretching every pound. Number 9. Economy sausages. If you ever had a sausage that was more rusk and fat than meat, you know the kind I mean. Walls, Richmond, or the supermarket's own. These economy bangers were a world away from the butcher's best. They'd shrink to half their size in the pan, but they filled a plate and could feed a crowd. Sausage and mash, sausage casserole, sausage sandwiches. If you had these for tea, you knew you were making do. Number 10. Bulk rice or pasta. Rice and pasta were the ultimate stretchers. Bought in big bags, they could fill plates for pennies and make leftovers go further. A bit of tinned tomato, a handful of frozen peas, and you had a meal. If you grew up with rice or pasta as a regular dinner, you knew your family was making every meal count. Number 11. Tinned fruit cocktail. Pudding was a luxury, but if you were lucky, there'd be a tin of fruit cocktail in syrup, usually the cheapest brand, heavy on syrup, light on fruit. Served with evaporated milk or on its own, it was a rare treat that made you feel like you were having something special. If tinned fruit cocktail was your idea of dessert, you knew money was tight. Number 12. Evaporated milk. Fresh cream was for the posh. Evaporated milk, Carnation or the own brand, was what you poured over tinned fruit, used in creamy desserts, or stirred into tea when the real stuff ran out. It lasted forever, was cheaper than cream, and could make even the plainest pudding feel a bit more special. If you grew up with evaporated milk, you knew your family was making do with what they had. Number 13. Instant mashed potato. Smash or the supermarket's own brand. Instant mash was a box of flakes that turned into mash with hot water. Real potatoes were for Sunday roasts or Christmas dinner. Instant mash was for every other day. It was quick, cheap, and could be stretched to feed a crowd. If you grew up with instant mash, you knew your family was watching every penny. Number 14. Cheap biscuits. Bourbons, rich tea, nice, or the supermarket's value digestives. If you grew up poor, these were the biscuits in your tin. Never the chocolate ones, always a bit soft, and bought in bulk. They were for tea breaks, packed lunches, or just to keep you going between meals. If you had cheap biscuits instead of the fancy ones, you knew you were making do. Number 15. Loose tea or value tea bags. A proper cuppa was non-negotiable, even when money was tight. Loose tea or the cheapest tea bags, PG Tips, Typhoo, or the supermarket's own, were bought in bulk and brewed strong. Milk was stretched, sugar was rationed, but the tea was always there. If you grew up with value tea, you knew your family had their priorities straight, even when the budget was tight. Number 16. Tinned soup. Heinz if you were lucky, but more often the supermarket's own brand. Tinned soup was a cheap filling meal that could be stretched with bread or bulked out with rice, tomato, vegetable or chicken, whatever was on offer. If you had tinned soup for tea, you knew it was a make-do night. Number 17. Bulk buy frozen chips. Fresh chips from the chippy were a treat. At home, it was bulk buy frozen chips. Cheap, easy, and could fill a plate for pennies. Oven chips, crinkle cut, or whatever was on offer. If you grew up with frozen chips instead of fresh, you knew your family was watching the budget. Number 18. Tinned rice pudding. Ambrosia if you were lucky, but more often the own brand version. Tinned rice pudding was a cheap, filling dessert that could be served hot or cold. A sprinkle of nutmeg if you were feeling fancy. If you had tinned rice pudding for afters, you knew you were making do. Number 19. Sliced processed cheese. Individually wrapped slices or the big block, processed cheese was a cheap way to add flavour to sandwiches or toasties. It melted into a strange, rubbery texture, but it was affordable and lasted ages. If you grew up with processed cheese instead of cheddar, you knew your family was stretching every pound. Number 20. Tinned baked beans. Heinz, if you could afford it, but more often the supermarket's own brand. Baked beans on toast, beans with sausages, beans in a jacket potato. If you grew up poor, beans were a staple, cheap, filling, and could be stretched to feed a family. If you had beans for tea more than once a week, you knew you were making do. If these groceries were in your house, you didn't need anyone to tell you money was tight. You could taste it in every meal. But here's the thing. These foods didn't just fill bellies, They built resilience, resourcefulness, and a sense of pride in making something out of nothing. If you grew up poor in Britain, you know these items by heart, and you probably still have a soft spot for at least one of them. Which of these did you have in your kitchen? And what's the one poor kid meal you secretly still love? Share your memories below.